So why don't you just introduce yourself real
Sure.
quickly?
I'll just look at you,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm Mike Gelfand, and I'm a veteran journalist and broadcaster. Worked for the Minneapolis Tribune, but actually starting at the Minnesota Daily right here. Not right here. We were over in the university campus then in Murphy Hall. But starting at the Minnesota Daily, and then I went to the Minneapolis Tribune, then I went to, then I went to the Wall Street Journal in Chicago, and the Minneapolis Tribune, and then eventually after the papers merged, as journalism was dying, I went into radio. And then as radio was dying, I retired.
And I'm Rob Hahn. I'll ask the questions. It's April 4th, 2019, and we are in the offices, the current offices of the Minnesota Daily at the University of Minnesota. First and foremost, I love personal stories and recollections, like the one you were telling me about Nick Coleman.
Yeah,
You know, that takes a theme, but it adds personal color to it.
yeah.
So
It's a vivid story,
yeah,
and you know,
the better.
the whole Red Barn thing was, I think for many of us, it was, it might have been the highlight of my whole career as a journalist, and I was a journalist for, if you count the Daily, which I do, because after all, we were salaried and we were out there. It wasn't like this,
Yeah.
I mean, we were out there writing stories every single day, and producing a pretty large newspaper, probably, in terms of the news hole, probably like 5 times the news hole of the St. Paul paper.
Wow.
And so it was a big thing. And then I worked for the Wall Street Journal, and I worked for the Minneapolis Tribune. But I think I probably have more vivid memories of the Red Barn bust that night of May 5th, 1970, than just about any story I've covered. I mean, I covered a lot of stories that made me laugh and cry.
Yeah.
Some of the stories haunt me to this day, but in terms of sheer adrenaline and exhilaration, that was something that was bigger than us.
Yeah. So Dinkytown, maybe start chronologically.
Sure.
What are your first memories? When did you first come to Dinkytown, and what stood out and still does when you think about it?
Well, I grew up in St. Paul on Cretin Avenue in what they call it the Groveland Mac neighborhood now. We didn't know from Mac in those days, but I guess they added a little class to it. And so Groveland Elementary was a school which was taught by and run by old spinsters. I guess maybe that's not a politically correct term anymore. But what would happen, it was all women, and they were almost all elderly because they'd just been there forever. And after World War II, there were any men that had been in the school of course went off to war and never came back to the school. And the women aged over the years and stayed there because if teachers got pregnant, then they couldn't teach anymore. It was considered, unacceptable, tawdry, I'm not sure what. These were strange times. And so most of the teachers were pretty tired. And my most vivid memory of going to Groveland Park Elementary was at the end of 6th grade. They would always come and give you a card saying you were promoted to the next grade. Well, at that time, Groveland Park was a kindergarten through 7th grade school. And 7th grade was when the boys got to take shop. So the lone male teacher in school was the guy who taught shop or hit you. There was 2 functions. If you messed up, you were called into his office and he would hit you. Usually it was like the hand on the radiator thing, slap you with the ruler, that kind of thing. Corporal punishment was still a thing. And but we didn't learn anything there. So we were astonished when they passed out the promotion cards, and one of the boys in the class, I'll call him George, it wasn't his real name, was called into the cloakroom. And then we heard sort of an accelerating squabble going on there, followed by a scream of despair from George, who then threw his stocking cap, he wore it all year round, from the cloakroom into the classroom. And we were totally puzzled, and then my friend, Kent Allen, who was the smartest kid in the class, said, I think he failed. And I said, you can't fail. They didn't teach us anything. How could you fail? But somehow he did. So that was Groveland Park Elementary. So then my parents decided that maybe I could learn something and sent me to University High School, which was a laboratory school on the university campus in Pike Hall. And so then I went from learning nothing to this school of brilliance, all these really smart kids. And I kind of made, I didn't do well there, especially at the beginning of it. And my escape was Dinkytown. I discovered this whole new world in Dinkytown. The first thing I discovered in Dinkytown happened to be what I thought of then, and I think still do, because it still exists. It may be the only thing there that still exists. Al's Breakfast. And I found a whole new world there. And started eating lunch there every day. We weren't supposed to go onto campus at that point. I think you had to be like maybe a senior or a junior, but I'd go into Al's Breakfast every day, get a stack of blues, maybe a side of bacon, also a new thing for me. So I didn't write the story quite, I didn't really use any of her notes, but what I did do was I had an entire paragraph devoted to the funny names of the society people, some of which I still remember. Topsy Ritz, there was Ford Crouch, there was, of course, the Heffelfingers were there. I just did an entire paragraph and walked into the paper the next day, and the first thing that happened was Wally Allen, the managing editor, who had devoted his entire life to making sure the paper was without offense. I mean, he wanted the dullest paper you could have. And no one had ever actually seen him leave his office. No one knew what he did. So when he called me into the office, everything stopped. Everyone was looking at what's going on there. And so I walked in, and his temple was kind of throbbing. And he said, I suppose you know why I called you in here. And I said, well, yeah, the Orchestra Hall story is a big front page story, yeah. He said, that's right. And I said, yeah. That was a fine piece of work, wasn't it? And it's like he went red. I thought he was going to have some sort of cerebral accident. And he said, and he couldn't think of anything to say, so he finally said, no, it was not. And anyway, so we had a nice discussion. I walked out. As I walked out, I heard Margaret Morris. She was talking to Jimmy Parsons, the assistant city editor. Jimmy was a good old boy from Tennessee. And the first thing I heard her saying was, and that son of a bitch. Hadn't heard that from her before, a little salty. And I'm walking by, and Jimmy grabs my arm, and he says, boy, I'm going to chew your ass out. Come here. And he like takes me, and we go into the conference room. He slams the door, and he says, that was one of the finest pieces we've ever run.
Nice.
It was a good story. So anyway, Dinkytown.
Yeah, back to Al's Breakfast.
Al's Breakfast. Al's Breakfast was the pulse of Dinkytown, and although I haven't been there in a few years now, I probably consumed at least a couple thousand of those blueberry pancakes over the years. I used to take my kids there. It's the thread, it's the Dinkytown thread, and that's still there. A lot of fascinating people, of course, that came and went in that place. You couldn't hang around too long, of course, because there were only 12 stools, as I recall. But it was kind of one of those places where everyone knew your name, and I can think of the professors I met there. I'd see my own professors there. I had an English professor, a Hungarian guy. He was actually a composition professor, and he was a wonderful guy. And I really enjoyed his class, but I never did get around to doing the final assignment. I actually attended the University of Minnesota for 4 years, and I think you needed something like 160 credits to graduate, and I think I had 78 after 4 years. Because I was working at the Daily. I didn't have time to do that stuff. I just remember going in there, and he said, Mr. Gelfand, it's so nice to see you. I can't help but notice that you haven't completed your final assignment. I said, well, I know it's been really busy. He said, oh, no, I apologize. I should not have mentioned it. That was the sort of warmth and camaraderie people had in those days, especially at Al's Breakfast. So naturally, it was just a place that I gravitated to. And at first, I probably didn't speak for the first 3 years I went in there. But after a while, I felt comfortable. Al himself was still there, and Al was that classic diner chef who, the cigarette would be dangling from his mouth. You might get an ash or two in your pancakes. But everybody loved Al. And it's still there after all these years. Obviously, Al's not there. Al died quite a while ago. So Al's Breakfast was the greatest place in the world. There were other places in Dinkytown that I remember, and most of them I've probably forgotten. Bridgman's was a hangout. Unfortunately, then McDonald's came in. And I think the Red Barn strategy, they knew how much the McDonald's was touted to be one of the most lucrative McDonald's in the country. Because it was such a great location on the university, just off the campus. I'm sure that when Red Barn wanted to go in, they figured they were going to make a killing too. And I guess thus I sort of segue into the Red Barn story.
Yeah,
although if you have any other questions about Dinkytown.
No, I'll come back to other questions.
I'm going to just grab this.
Yeah. Let's start with your recollection of the night when you first met Nick Coleman.
Yeah. Yeah, it was winter of 1970, and I didn't know it, but the unrest in the Dinkytown neighborhood, in the neighborhood there, was just beginning. And as I say, I knew nothing about it, but one night, probably was February, we were just about getting ready to put the paper to bed. And I looked in the doorway. There was a kind of a lanky, slouching guy with blue jeans and the obligatory plaid shirt, and he was handing this sheaf of yellow-lined notebook paper to the secretary and explaining, I guess, why he was there. Well, eventually, she came over to me and said, this guy came in, he thinks that you might want to run this story. Well, we didn't really take stories any more than, like the Star Tribune would. People would come in there and say, hey, I think you might want to run this story. We would have, it just wasn't done that way. But she typed it up because I couldn't read it, and it was better than any story, better written, and a better story than anything we had in the Daily that day. And so eventually I asked him to come over, and we talked and kind of hit it off. We had a lot in common. Nick Coleman, the son, of course, at that time, he was known as the son of the great politician, Nicholas Coleman, but Nick himself went on to a great career in journalism. And Nick was 1 month exactly younger than me, so we got to be good friends. But at any rate, I saw this as a great story and could see the potential of the story building, and I thought it would be good for the community, good for the Daily. And so I said to him, I think I'd like you to do one of these stories every day. And he said, yeah, that's no problem. And he did it. Every single day he came up with a new angle, a better story every day. And of course, as he did, the tensions built in Dinkytown and built right up until the night of May 5th, when everything exploded.
Before we get to May 5th, what was it about the story that intrigued you so much? And what about it did you see as a catalyst to putting this story on the map through the Daily?
Well, the first thing that I noticed was that we had a reporter there, a journalist who could write, and who obviously had a passion for this story, who obviously was kind of locked in with the community. He obviously knew what was going on. And in just that first story, he really made clear what an affront it was to the people of that community. And of course, obviously, you can't ignore the backdrop. The backdrop, May of 1970, we'd had which I covered, the huge anti-war march in Washington I think it was the fall of 1969, 500,000 people. So the tensions were building on campus. The tensions were everywhere, exacerbated by the mayor of Minneapolis, Charles Stenvig, who was a law and order guy, more order than law, as it turned out. And he himself, was a complete shock to the community, because even then, it was just sort of taken for granted that a Democrat and a liberal would become elected mayor, but the Democrats kind of were looking the other way, and Charles Stenvig tapped into the backlash. So you had the backlash, you had people who were very angry about the students, you had the students who were very angry about the war, you had Red Barn, the tawdry Red Barn chain, which was going to be a complete culture shock and an affront to the community. Dinkytown was a place that celebrated individualism, and what was happening there was the battle of corporations versus individualism was, it wasn't like today when the battle has been won. It was still being fought then, and people thought individualism was still a thing, and those were all basically, almost all boutique businesses there, except for McDonald's. Most of these, there weren't chain businesses there. There weren't franchises, and they were small businesses. And so everyone had a personality. Al's Breakfast, maybe the most of all. So there were all of these tectonic plates shifting there, and it was a reflection of what was going on in Washington, Vietnam, in Minneapolis. So everything coalesced around that, what maybe seemed by some to be a fairly trivial issue, but it wasn't trivial because it was all connected to all those passions. So it was almost inevitable that in their own way they would explode.
Describe your recollections of the night of May 5th.
Well, we knew that we were pretty sure the police were coming in. The word was out, and there were various leaks coming in, and so there was an occupation that had gone on for some time in these buildings. The buildings had been condemned, the businesses had been rooted out, but no one knew exactly what to expect. It was almost like a war scene, because the first notice you had of it was the sound of the helicopters overhead, and there was a huge crowd gathering. There was a police presence. But as the helicopters hovered overhead, then police came in from everywhere. There was a busload of riot police with batons and shields. It almost was like their presence almost guaranteed some kind of horrible disruption. From the alleys, police were pouring in, it was somewhat expected. It was still a shock. And then as night fell, the searchlights from the helicopter, and then the police were shouting to people to get out of there. People were being rousted. There was a huge bus, a paddy wagon, essentially, and I don't know how many people were arrested that night. I think it was close to 100. One of which was Nick Coleman. So that's why I covered the story that night, because Nick had gotten himself arrested. And I use that phrase decidedly. I think Nick thought it would be a better story to be arrested than to be covering covering what was happening there. He was probably right. He got more than one good story out of it. And it was probably 3, 4 in the morning when the bulldozers came in. It didn't take long to destroy everything there. By 5 a.m. or so, we were back at the Daily office, and our editor, Glenn Hoveman, wonderful editor, decided we were going to put out an extra. And I've never been a part of that. I'd never had before or since. So we were creating this newspaper, which had to be done in it was an 8-page wraparound, which we had to do in about 2-3 hours. And I mean, there was a sense of shock, of dismay, but also, of course, of exhilaration. Covering a story like that, that's what it was about. And we were journalists, you know, first and foremost. I mean, we weren't really out there protesting. We were there just covering the story. So that was pretty cool. One of the things I remember best about covering the story was about 5:30 a.m. I called up the Bread Barn's vice president in charge of this area, a guy by the name of Lafferty. Don't remember his first name. He didn't quite get it. He didn't quite realize that to actually build that thing was going to be a disaster. Of course, it never got built. We knew it would never get built, but he didn't. And he was home at 5:30 asleep. And so I called him up. What a wonderful time to be a journalist. You could call someone up at 5:30 in the morning and they would answer their phone. You know, now you wouldn't be able, you'd know their phone number. You wouldn't have their cell. But, so I called him up and he was, of course, awakened and he was indignant. And he said, you woke me up, it's 5:30 in the morning. And I said, being a typically snarky student and journalist, I said, well, you should feel very fortunate because the rest of us were up all night because of you.
You mentioned the term, we'll move on from the Red Barn here.
Sure.
The term individualism.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me more how you think that applied to Dinkytown back in the day.
Yeah.
And how it does or does not apply to it today.
Sure. Well, Dinkytown was not it wasn't a strip mall. It was, I think when McDonald's came in, that was our first sniff of what a franchise looked like in our community. And so there was a vision there that maybe this is what was going to become of Dinkytown. And I guess in some ways it has happened. Not completely, of course. But, you know, it was and I think in Minneapolis in general, you know, you had a police chief turned mayor there who was really there to serve the interests of the business community. Culture was so much different then. We now have, well, take Amazon, for example, today. On a good day, Amazon's market value is $1 trillion, which means Amazon on a good day is worth more than about 60% of our population. So this was sort of the gateway, we thought of in that day, to that kind of a culture. A small piece of it, maybe, just a whiff of it. But still, we saw that as a takeover of Dinkytown, which essentially it was. So I think when those businesses left, those were real people there. They weren't corporations, they were real people. And they were going away and they were never going to come back. On a side note, one of the things we lost in Dinkytown that day when the bulldozers came in was a phone booth. And to me, that phone booth represented something. It was quaint. And it was attached, it was actually in sort of an alleyway between the building that was raised and the building next to it. And the guy who actually owned the phone book was a guy named Lou, who owned Lou's Diner. Lou's Diner sort of served as the overflow diner for Al's. If the line was out the door at Al's and there was no way you were going to get in, you walked around the corner to Lou's. Lou's didn't quite have the class of Al's. It didn't quite measure up to that. The food was not up. I mean, Al's was like a gourmet diner. The omelets and the pancakes and the waffles. It was a classy place, but it was also a place where ordinary people hovered and chatted and shared stories about their day and their classes, complained about their professors, professors complained about their students. I mean, there was a heartbeat there. And so, you know, it was where, in fact, after the buildings were raised, you know, Al was just coming in, and a lot of the people who had been in the crowd who hadn't been arrested or didn't have to go to work went into Al's. After we put the paper to bed, that's the first place I went, was Al's. Everybody wanted to talk about it. So I guess that's what I'm thinking about when I think about individualism versus, well, kind of the, franchise USA.
Yeah. Let me run through some names. You may or may not know them, but if you do, I'd love to hear your memories. Bill Tilton, the
Sure, Bill.
renowned protester.
Bill was a member of the Minnesota 8, and I covered that trial. And so Bill was not a friend of mine, but I knew Bill very well. I don't think Bill trusted me because I was a journalist, and I can't blame him for that. And I'm kind of proud that he didn't trust me, because I am left-leaning, but I tried to be fair in my stories. Maybe Bill didn't like them. I don't know. Maybe he did, but yeah, I sat through the trial of the Minnesota 8. It was that in itself was something that became a cultural marker. Eight protesters who had gotten busted protesting the war, refused to, in some cases, refused to go to be enlisted. Bill himself, as I recall, was found guilty of draft evasion, but was Miles Lord the judge?
I can't remember.
It might have been Miles. If it had been Miles, Miles would never have sent him off to prison or anything like that.
Well, then it wasn't Miles, because I think Bill did a little time.
Did Bill did a little time? No, you know what? God, I don't remember who it was. There were so many trials in those days. Bill Turchik, remember him? He was part of the Minnesota 8. Later, as a journalist, I played ping pong against him. I was doing a story, and Bill Turchik was the greatest ping pong player in Minnesota, despite the fact he was about 4'10". I played with him, and I beat him. The catch being that he was playing with a Pepsi can.
How about Father Harry Burry? Did you ever cover him? He ran the Newman Center for a while.
Ran the Newman Center, still around, as a matter of fact. In fact, my friend Jeff Strait just did a show with him. Jeff Strait does a show called Democratic Visions. It's run out of Eden Prairie and Bloomington. And if he was just telling me the other day about talking to Father Burry and what a great guy he is, and still passionate. But I didn't know him.
Okay. Walking, talking Phil. Black gentleman who would walk around and...
Walking Phil.
Walking Phil.
Walking Phil was actually a schizophrenic. You probably knew that. And Walking Phil, I lived later on, I lived across the street from Cedar Lake. And I would see Walking Phil walking in front of me in Cedar Lake when I got up in the morning. Later, I would see him walking past the Minneapolis Tribune building, 425 Portland, when I was working there. And he would send me hate letters, as he sent many of us hate letters. And some of those letters, you would see he was so angry that the hole in the O of his typewriter would be punched out. That was Walking Phil, as I recall. I may be thinking of another guy who walked around all day, because there were two of them, and maybe I've conflated the two.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, no, it's a better story that way anyway.
Right. Dylan had gone to New York before you got to the U, but did he ever come back, and did you have any act?
Well, Dylan had not. He had not gone to. He had not. He was still He was still playing at the Scholar. He probably started playing at the Scholar when I was in junior high school, as I recall, at University High School. So we knew about him. And people, older people in the school. When I was in 7th grade, we had great musicians like Dave Naftalin and Dave Ray, who went on to become celebrated musicians, and both I'm sure knew Dylan very well, and so there was a buzz about Dylan when I was in junior high school. I never got to see him play, as I recall, he had for a short time worked at the Daily too. There was a picture, in fact, at the Daily at the time of him at a desk there. So I know he did work there, probably very briefly.
Melvin McCosh from the bookstore?
Bookstore. Only knew him to see him in the bookstore, you know, and you couldn't see much in the bookstore because there was such a clutter there. But that was a great bookstore. That was also, you know, a deep imprint on the culture of Dinkytown, of course.
What do you think it was about Dinkytown? What about the social and political fabric that lent itself to so many different backgrounds coming together to become so active? You know, active, whether it's in protesting the Red Barn,
Right.
the Vietnam War. What was it about that fabric? How would you describe it?
Intense. And people were passionate. And just like in journalism, stories take on a momentum of their own, too big to really perceive the future of those stories. That's a great thing about any good story is you don't know where it's going to end. You don't know what stories it's going to spawn. Dinkytown was like that. It was sort of like a cerebral petri dish is what it was like. Something was growing in there that was bigger than any one person, and that's just the way it turned out.
What changed it, in your opinion?
Red Barn. Something died that day. I won't say that there was a sense of failure, but there might have been a sense of inevitability. And of course, you have to remember that same day that the bulldozers came in, those 4 kids were killed at Kent State. And I think that ushered us all into a new era. It wasn't fun and games anymore.
You mentioned you take your kids to Dinkytown on occasion.
Yeah, I used to when they were young, yeah. And they loved it, you know, 5, 6, 7 years old.
Yeah.
Now, every Saturday they'd wake me up. We got to go to Al's.
So you've had, obviously...
I'm going to grab this.
Yep. The ability, whether it's good fortune or not, to experience Dinkytown in what I would consider kind of the halcyon days.
Right.
And then see it change.
Yeah.
As you've gone back over the years, what do you miss the most that isn't there anymore?
Really, it's more just the culture there. It's more the dynamic, the vibe. It's not there anymore. All those people who were so passionate, they're not so passionate anymore. The people who are there, of course, are like me, elderly now and dissipated. But it's just, you know, eras come and go. It's funny because a lot of friends of mine from that era, kids I went to high school with and college with, became teachers. Actually, my oldest son is a teacher. My oldest son complains about what those old guys who I went to high school complain about, and that is that their kids they don't question authority. You know, a teacher whose kids don't question authority, if the teacher is cognizant of a teacher's mission, feel like there's something empty in the classroom. Maybe they feel like they failed a little, because education is about the Socratic method. And the Socratic method demands that everyone, teachers and students, challenge convention. So when that dies, as it seemed to have, part of that culture, part of the what makes education so great dies with it.
What do you want to ask that I'm forgetting?
Do we need a new culture, counterculture movement?
Yeah. Well, I guess the best word I could use would be yes. I talked about Amazon, the fact that on a good day they're worth $1 trillion, which is more than 60% of our population. And I don't know. I also talked about Charles Stenving and how he was a law and order guy who emphasized, I guess, order over law. And he was also, however, a kind of he was he was one of those, he was an agitator is what he was. They called us agitators, my fellow students agitators. But really, you know, the true agitators are people who have power. So maybe Chuck Stenvig in those days was a very small version of what Donald Trump would become. If students are going to rise up today, if there is going to be a counterculture, it's going to be a reaction to what's happening in the country now. And the fact that our two-party system has died. You know, when the two-party system dies, then that also affects the willingness of people to question authority. The emphasis now is on obedience to the president. That's half the country almost believes that we need to be obedient to the president. There's a culture there. There's a, you know, there's a cult more than anything. And that is antithetical to the blossoming of truth and individualism. Truth and individualism, of course, are inextricably tied together. You can't have one without the other.